What's up guys, my name's Stu, and today we're going to be talking about ships that I think deserve legendary versions in Star Trek Online. I'm not giving this one a number because anytime I do, I end up going over the number, so let's just see how far this one goes. Anyway, legendary ships. There are a number of them in the game at this point, but I feel like there are still quite a few ships that still deserve that treatment. So in this video, I'm going to go over a bunch of ships that I think deserve legendary versions and give a little bit of an idea of what I think their stats should look like. The first ship on this wish list should be of no surprise to anyone, the legendary Akira command warship. This is something Augie and I have been talking about for what feels like at least 2 years now at this point. It's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but it's what it feels like. While the Akira has been little more than a background ship throughout Star Trek, I've always felt that this deserves a legendary ship, largely due to its status as a longtime fan favorite design. In fact, it was so much of a fan favorite that Doug Drexler actually based the NX-01 Enterprise's design off this ship. Now, the idea for this ship is to make it a crazy meta torpedo boat, because that's literally what the Akira is. In-universe, this thing has 16 torpedo tubes. How can this thing be anything else but a torpedo boat? Now, as you all should know at this point, a proper torpedo boat needs command seating. Concentrate Firepower 3 is a must for torpedoes, and Call Emergency Artillery is a really nice bonus because that also deals kinetic damage. Also, keep in mind, on Federation characters, Call Emergency Artillery looks like a bunch of Defiant-class ships, so you'd be able to recreate that rescue fleet that saves the USS Prometheus and Message in a Bottle with the press of a button. Though you would have one extra Defiant because there were only 2 in the episode, but who cares, it would be cool. The ship would also require a 4-4 weapons layout. I'm sure there are going to be plenty of you in the comments saying, no, it needs a 5-3 layout. Shut up, no it doesn't. Remember, the goal is to make this as optimal as possible for torpedo build. And 4-4 is actually better for torpedo builds because you can get more mines in the back. A 5th weapon slot in the front is not going to do much for one. Now, in Star Trek Online, the Akira is an escort, which don't normally have 5 normal weapon slots. In fact, the original Tier 6 Akira has a 4-3 weapons layout with an experimental weapon. But as good as Soliton Wave Impeller is, it still doesn't beat a 4th mine launcher, which is why I want the legendary Akira to be made into a warship, so it ditches the experimental weapon for an 8th weapon slot and I can get another mine in the back. This would also likely mean ditching the hangar bay because the original T6 Akira is a strike wing escort, which honestly I am okay with, but if Cryptic wants to make its first strike wing warship, I'm certainly not going to complain. One of the downsides with command seating is that it doesn't have any abilities that trigger unconventional systems, so the ship is also going to need a secondary temporal or intel seat, either at the lieutenant or lieutenant commander level. Lieutenant commander would be preferred, but is probably pushing it. Personally, I think temporal makes a bit more sense because then you can kind of connect to the lineage of the NX-01. Like I said, this ship inspired the look of the NX class, so in universe you could easily say that the reverse is true, that Starfleet designed the Akira with design elements from the old NX class in mind. And as we know, the NX had plenty of its own time travel shenanigans. Actually, you could connect the Akira to time travel as well. It's a bit of a stretch, but keep in mind this ship was introduced in Star Trek First Contact. Several Akira-class ships were at the Battle of Sector 001, and following the destruction of the Borg cube, the escaping Borg sphere immediately opens up a temporal rift. So yeah, there's my excuse for a temporal seat. Next up on the list, the Prometheus. Another big fan favorite design, this one introduced in the Star Trek Voyager episode Message in a Bottle, where it was prominently featured. Now, pretty much everything I said about the legendary Akira command warship, honestly you could say the same thing about the Prometheus. The Hestia has a lieutenant commander command seat, so you could easily update the legendary version to a full command ship. A secondary intel seat makes perfect sense because the ship was developed in secret, and then stolen by the Romulans. And since this ship was developed for long-range tactical missions and launched during the Dominion War, a warship designation could easily fit this ship. So if Cryptic wanted to give us a legendary Prometheus command warship instead, I wouldn't be upset about it. However, I do have an idea for an alternative, because frankly, I think a legendary Prometheus is a great candidate for an intel ship. Give it a 5-2 weapons layout, or 5-3 if they want to make it a warship, and set this thing up to be a great surgical strikes build. Like I said, the Prometheus was developed in secret. Only 4 people in Starfleet were trained to operate the ship before it was stolen by the Romulans. So to me, intel makes perfect sense for this ship. However, Miracle Worker could also work on this ship because the multi-vector assault mode gives very Miracle Worker vibes to me. So I would say make it a primary intel ship with a secondary Miracle Worker seat. Making the legendary Prometheus an intel ship is also a great excuse to give it the new intel skin like the legendary Vesta got. Can you imagine how cool the Prometheus would look with that new intel hull? I think that'd be awesome. Next on the list is the Nebula class. Honestly, do I really need to justify why the Nebula class needs a legendary version? This ship was featured so many times throughout the Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and even Voyager on a few occasions. It's the Galaxy class's little sister, of course it deserves a legendary. Now since the T6 Sutherland has an intel seat, it'd be easy to upgrade the legendary version to a full temporal ship. Though because of the mission pod, I feel like intel works really well for this ship too. Though I just had another idea that I wish I'd had while I was making these slides: make it a spearhead science vessel. The Nebula class is huge, it's almost as big as a Galaxy class, so it makes total sense that it would be able to fit one more weapon slot than most science vessels. A 4-3 weapons layout would also give the ship much more mass appeal to the players. Science builds still really only appeal to a rather niche crowd, largely because their requirements are often rather expensive. But making this a spearhead opens up other build options, because that extra weapon slot means you can be more reliant on your weapons. So yeah, Legendary Nebula Temporal Spearhead, that's the idea. Next up is the Luna class. It's the Titan, with the attention this ship has gotten in recent years, thanks to Star Trek Lower Decks and Picard, plus its legacy from the old beta canon books, on top of the fact that the Tier 5 version of this ship has been in the game since launch. This ship definitely deserves a legendary ship. This is another one where the easy solution would be just to make it full spec. So in this case, a full command ship. I originally had the idea to make this a spearhead instead of a science destroyer, but while recording decided that a spearhead would better suit the Nebula class. So I guess just leave it as a science destroyer. Though I would like to see this get a secondary temporal or intel seat to better support the science mode. Command seating offers very little for science builds. Next on the list is another science vessel, the Nova class. Featured prominently in the Voyager 2-part episode Equinox, and its Rhode Island refit playing a big part in the first half of Voyager's finale Endgame. This is another one that I think definitely deserves the legendary treatment, despite the fact that the Tier 6 version really isn't that old yet. Now, I know at least one of you in the comments is going to be saying that this should be an intel ship, and I actually agree with that. From what we know of the Nova class from Star Trek lore, honestly, intel on the ship makes about just as much sense as pilot did. And I think intel makes even more sense when you take into account the Season 2 finale of Lower Decks, when Starfleet security arrested Captain Freeman after she was accused of bombing the Pac-led planet. They left in a Nova class. My big fear of Cryptic making a legendary Nova is that I'd be really afraid of them taking away everything that I actually like about the existing Nova class, the T6 Equinox that is, which is a scout ship, so it has a bunch of universal seating and it has a 4-2 weapons layout. Those two elements are why I really like the Equinox despite its pilot seating. Take those away, and then the Nova class is just another science ship. So yeah, I'd love to see a legendary Intel Nova, but only if it's still a scout ship with a 4-2 weapons layout. Speaking of Star Trek Lower Decks, of course we're going to bring up the hero ship of that show, the California class. This is another one that really isn't that old. In fact, the California class was only introduced to Star Trek Online earlier this year. But if you remember my initial review of the California class, you probably remember that I wasn't overly thrilled with its stats. I still take issue with the fact that they decided to make this a utility cruiser instead of a frigate. The idea of the California class is that they were supposed to be jack-of-all-trades type ships, and what says jack-of-all-trades more than a bunch of universal seating? But instead we got a utility cruiser, which had way too much engineering seating. So what I would love to see from a legendary California class is to make it an actual jack-of-all-trades ship, i.e. a frigate. Basically, I think the legendary California should be a miracle worker version of the Bozeman. Another reason why I want to see a legendary California is because I had a really funny idea for the skin. Remember in the Season 2 finale when they had to strip off the outer hull? I think that should be its skin, the naked Cerritos. It would probably be a stupid amount of work because they'd have to make a whole new hull material just for that ship, but I think it would be really funny. Now moving on to some non-Federation ships, first up, the Negh'Var. This is the last TNG-era Klingon ship to get a legendary version. We've seen this ship throughout the show a number of times, including the TNG finale Endgame, one of my favorite episodes of all time, DS9's Way of the Warrior, Voyager's finale Endgame, plus a number of Mirror Universe episodes also in DS9. Now, this is another ship where command would be an obvious decision, considering it was designated the new Klingon flagship in Way of the Warrior, and had both Gowron and Martok on board during the battle. But considering this ship was first introduced in the alternate future part of All Good Things, and also in Voyager's Endgame, I think this should be a temporal ship. That and because after going through this list, I didn't recommend a lot of these ships to become temporal. It was basically just this and the Nebula, which is weird because I actually like temporal ships. In fact, I'm going to change that right now. Remember what I said about the Nova? Forget Intel, make it a full temporal ship. A 4-2 scout ship that's also a full temporal ship, that would be incredible. But yeah, legendary temporal Negh'Var. I think that would be really cool. Next up is another Klingon flagship, the Bortas'qu. This is Star Trek Online's Klingon flagship, and of the game's 3 flagships, the other 2 being the Odyssey and the Scimitar, this is the only one that hasn't received a legendary version yet. I'd love to see this ship get a legendary version purely for the sake of it would be a great excuse to also revamp the ship's texture. Because, again, unlike the Yorktown and the Scimitar, this is the only flagship that hasn't gotten a revamp. It's a flagship, so again, command specialization is an obvious choice. But at that point, it's basically just a matter of how do you make it different than the legendary Odyssey. And the idea I had was to, instead of making this ship a dreadnought, make it a juggernaut. There are only a handful of juggernauts currently in the game, and they're all lockbox or promo ships. And their flagship being made into a juggernaut makes total sense for the Klingons. And honestly, I'm not even totally attached to the idea of this being a command ship. Miracle Worker or Intel would also be really cool on the ship to make it more ideal for an energy weapon build, which does kind of make sense because it does have those giant disruptor mounts on the front of the ship. Honestly, I'm kind of liking that idea better now. A 5-3 Miracle Worker Juggernaut, and just give it a really crappy turn rate so it's not too overpowered. Or leave it as a Dreadnought. Making it Miracle Worker is at least enough to set it apart from the legendary Odyssey and Scimitar. I got one more Klingon ship for this legendary wish list, the Discovery D7. This ship is the modern take on the classic D7 and it's L'Orel's flagship. Plus the Discovery Constitution and the TOS from Star Trek Picard also got legendary versions, so why shouldn't this one? Though if I'm honest, the main reason I want a legendary version of this ship is because I want Ruin of Our Enemies unlocked on my whole account. Stats wise, this is another obvious contender for a command ship. Though honestly I feel like I'm going a bit heavy with the command ship, so really you can go with anything but pilot on this. I still think command is the best option because we already have a Miracle Worker version of this and the Constitution, that's the promo versions, but those promo versions also have a secondary command seat. And while the legendary Discovery Constitution is a temporal ship, you could basically take the same stats from that ship, but then swap out the temporal seating for command. I guess you could go Intel as well, but considering this was a L'Orel ship, I still think command is the best choice for it. Next up is a Romulan ship, the Mogai. The Mogai's first and so far only canon appearance was in Star Trek Nemesis, though that might be changing if you've seen the promotional art for Season 3 of Lower Decks. It's also the last canon Romulan ship from the old Star Trek shows to be made into a legendary version, which is a large part of the reason why I think it needs one. Also, giving this ship a legendary version would finally be a good excuse to give the ship the visual revamp it desperately needs, because I'm pretty sure this model hasn't been touched since Legacy of Romulus. For the ship's specializations, Intel seems like an obvious choice because, you know, Romulans. However, both the legendary TOS and Scimitar were also Intel ships. So instead of that, I think this ship should be made into a Miracle Worker. The only thing we really saw it do was decloak and fire a bunch of disruptors, so make it ideal for an energy weapon build. And a good way to do that is to make it a Miracle Worker with a 5-2 weapons layout. Another reason why I think this needs to be a Miracle Worker ship is because there aren't a lot of Miracle Worker warbirds. There's the 3 that came out in the Miracle Worker Cruiser bundle, the legendary Dederadex, and that's about it. This would be a great opportunity to add not just another Miracle Worker warbird, but one that's an escort warbird. The other 4 are all cruiser types. The next one on this list is a bit of a weird one because it's actually not a ship from any of the 4 playable factions. The Cardassian Galor. While the Cardassians aren't technically a playable faction, they are a playable race for both the Federation and KDF. And more importantly, as to why I think this deserves a legendary version, is that this was a prominent feature throughout the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. Especially Deep Space Nine, because, you know, that just makes sense. Cardassians. This is another one where releasing a legendary version would be a good excuse to go back and revamp these old textures. Another nice thing about the Galor is that it's actually 2 canon Cardassian ships. The Galor is the Tier 5 version, whereas the Tier 6 version was the Keldon, which the Keldon was just the same model as the Galor, just with some extra bits glued onto it. For its specialization, Intel is definitely an obvious choice here, mostly because all of the Tier 6 Cardassian ships are Intel ships, though I guess it would be up to Cryptic if they wanted to stick to that theme or do something completely different, because the Galor was kind of the general all-purpose Cardassian ship, so really you can do whatever you want with it. Now the next one on the list is an even weirder ask, the Veteran Heavy Destroyers. These are the ships from the old Veteran reward system, which these days are pretty much only accessible through the lifetime subscription. Now, there are 4 of these ships, one for each faction. All 4 are pretty much the same, they just have the usual faction differences, so since they're virtually identical, there's really no point in making a legendary version for all 4 ships. So my idea is to just make one ship with updated stats, which mostly just includes giving it a full command spec. The question then becomes, which ship do you make into a legendary version? The Fed version is the easy choice. The majority of Star Trek Online's player base is Fed only, and it would be a good excuse to update the Manticore into the Type 7A hull. And plus, you know, that's Nog's ship. But instead, I think what they should do is make a new faction-neutral design, an Alliance Heavy Destroyer. It feels like a good compromise, and it's a way to finally introduce a ship that's actually worth the price of the lifetime subscription. Because for real, at this point in the game, those Heavy Destroyers without a full command spec, they are very dated at this point in the game. Now, the next 3 ships I'm going to talk about actually already have legendary versions. But as we saw with the 12th anniversary bundle, Cryptic is certainly willing to re-release old ships in new stats, even if they already have a legendary version. So the first one I'm going to talk about is an Intel version of the Burrell class Bird of Prey. I don't know about you guys, but I always found the legendary version of this ship to be a bit disappointing. Having a 4-2 weapons layout, but also being a full pilot ship, it really didn't have stats that reflected its legendary status. I, and I'm sure plenty of people in my comment section, would have preferred a Bird of Prey that's a full Intel ship with a 5-1 weapons layout. 5-1 just makes sense for this ship. I mean, look at the Bird of Prey's model. All of its guns are pointed forward. Seriously, tell me, where is the aft weapon on a Bird of Prey? And Intel makes sense for this ship because, well, that's kind of the main thing we saw it doing throughout most of the shows. Sneaking along, hiding in cloak, waiting for its moment to strike. Honestly, on top of all this, I would say give it a Lieutenant Commander command seat so we can go full General Chang on this thing. By which I mean give us a torpedo build that can cloak. I compared this to an Intel version of the D4X when I was making these slides, but I'm realizing now I should have said a more Klingon version of the legendary TOS. Because the TOS is an Intel ship with a Lieutenant Commander seat and an enhanced battle cloak, meaning it can fire torpedoes while cloaked. Next on the wish list is a Terran version of the original series Constitution class. I'm sure someone's going to come up in the comments and try to say there's already too many Constitution class ships in the game. Shut up, there's no such thing as too many Constitution class ships. It honestly surprises me that this ship isn't already in the game. With all the Mirror Universe content they've been pushing out in the past couple years, I would think creating the ship from the original Mirror Universe episode Mirror Mirror would be a higher priority. For the specializations, again, pretty much anything but pilot. The original promo version of this ship, the Temporal Light Cruiser, was a temporal ship, and it also had a secondary Lieutenant Commander command seat, and the promo version was a full Miracle Worker ship, so that would leave Intel as the only one left. Though if you include the Kelvin Timeline and Discovery era constitutions, then yeah, even Intel's been done too. Honestly, I really haven't put too much thought into the stats of this thing, I just want this ship in the game for the sake of it being in the game. Because it bugs me that even with all the Mirror Universe content in the game, that the original Mirror Universe ship still isn't in it. Actually, the same could also be versioned for a Terran version of the NX class. In a Mirror Darkly was one of Star Trek Enterprise's best episodes in my opinion, so it kinda surprises me that we don't have a Mirror NX class in the game yet. I probably should have made a slide for that one too, but I was too busy thinking about this last ship. An Intel version of the Yorktown. If you're surprised that I'm talking about wanting yet another version of the Odyssey class, you're either new here or you have not been paying attention. I've said many times that the Yorktown is my favorite ship in Star Trek, not just Stowe, all of Star Trek, and lately I've really been wanting one that can do a Surgical Strikes build. I also want it to have a Lieutenant Commander temporal seat so it can use recursive shearing, and I want it to have a 5-3 weapons layout because I really wanted the Lexington to have one, but they still gave it a 4-4. Since the devs probably think what I'm asking is unrealistic, let's just keep adding to the pile and say let's make this one a warship too. Yeah, I don't expect this to ever really happen, but it is my new obsession, so I'm going to keep complaining about it until something else catches my attention. But honestly, I really do think an Intel Yorktown would be a really cool idea. You know, give it a new model and that new Intel skin that came with the legendary Vesta. I think that would look really cool on this. So yeah, those are the ships that I think deserve legendary versions that haven't gotten them yet. Plus a couple ships that I think deserve new variants. You know, something akin to the Terran ships from the 12th anniversary bundle. Let me know what you guys think of this list, if you think there's anything I should have added, or if you disagree on the stats that I proposed. Anyway, please be sure to like and subscribe while you're down there, and hit that bell for notifications. If you'd like to further support the channel, hit the join button, or the super thanks button, or find the link to the merch store down in the description. My name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time.